Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for today's Enterprise Ireland webinar, The Future of UK Ports, Development Plans and Supply Chain Opportunities. For those unfamiliar with Enterprise Ireland and the work that we do, we are the government organisation responsible for the development and growth of Irish enterprises in global markets. And we have offices in over 40 countries around the world. I myself, I've joined Enterprise Ireland back in September in the London office, and I'm working closely with Dara Cotter and Liam Curran, who lead the work of the Enterprise Ireland offshore wind cluster. Within the cluster, there is a distinct collective capability among Irish companies in the ports and harbours supply chain, many of whom join us online today. While ports and harbours are a critical element to the growth of offshore wind, today we'll also be discussing wider developments in the UK port sector and key areas of growth within the market. As Ireland's largest export market, the UK is a crucial trading partner for Irish businesses. With UK ports set to undergo significant development and investment, today's session will aim to highlight the key opportunities for collaboration between UK ports and innovative Irish companies. Amongst UK port industry developments is the bidding process for the establishment of 10 Freeports across the UK, which is set to conclude in 2021. The UK government has also doubled down on its renewable energy commitments, increasing its offshore wind energy target by 10 gigawatts to 40 gigawatts by 2030. Logistical and customs challenges brought about by the end of the Brexit transition period also suggest further funding and expansion of infrastructure. To address these key challenges and to take a look at the investment pipeline in UK ports over the coming years, we are delighted to be joined by an experienced panel of industry experts. Today for you, we have Richard Ballantyne, who's the Chief Executive of the British Ports Association. We have Simon Brett, who is the Commercial Director at Port of Tyne. And we have Alan Duncan, who is an offshore wind market expert and the Director at Scotia Supply Chain. Please feel free to submit questions to the speakers via the questions tab on the sidebar, which is to the right of your screen. Our Q&A with Richard, Simon and Alan will take place at the end of the three presentations, and your questions will be relayed by the Enterprise Ireland team. After the Q&A, I will also draw your attention to a second webinar that we're running this week, where 5 innovative Irish companies will present their capability and industry experience in the ports sector. We'd encourage anyone who's not already registered for this showcase to do so via our registration link, which is available in the chat bar. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Richard Ballantyne, who's the Chief Executive of the British Ports Association, to begin his presentation. Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. As Jack alluded to, my name's Richard Ballantyne. I'm the Chief Executive of the British Ports Association, which is a trade body for UK ports and harbours. I'm not controlling my slides, so apologies if I yell out next slide, please, very frequently, but very much in that vein. Can I have the next slide, please? So just very quickly about my organisation, this is what I usually call is our propaganda, effectively all the stuff about us. We represent 86% of port activities by cargo through the UK, including all the main passenger ports, cruise and ferry companies who have had a particular dent during the coronavirus pandemic with travel restrictions, etc. We also represent all the main ro-ro ports, which is particularly relevant to some of our colleagues in Ireland, but also more widely on the Brexit front, because it is fair to say that that's the sector potentially that has the most to do to overcome a lot of the new challenges of the UK's departure from the customs union and the single market. But also very close to our hearts in the BPA, things like energy transition, and including renewable energy transition, and also other things like leisure, recreation and fishing. We have a lobbying role. Ports in the UK are private sector in style, independent of government, and the BPA, as well as providing a network, is lobbying on their behalf to try and encourage government to create a pro-business and ports regulatory environment, etc. Final thing I would say is we are an import-driven economy, which is largely due to some economic reforms through the 1970s, 80s and 90s. And that has an implication on our port activities as we are. A lot of ports are effectively gateways for international trade into the UK. And indeed, it's 95% of our trade comes through our seaports. So very important to the economy. Can I have the next slide, please? That's just a short summary of the trade outlook of the UK. You will see that liquid bulk still is our core activity. I mean, that's big, heavy products, oil and gas, etc. But a very, very important part of the sector, of course, is our dry bulks and also roll-on, roll-off and low sectors. So unitized is forecast to grow by about 40% over the next 30 years, so very important to the UK, etc. Can I have the next slide, please? But it's not all just about cargo, of course. There's many other types of activities, and I think we're going to talk about this during our Q&A later. But offshore energy, and as well as oil and gas, but renewables, marine wind, and all those kind of things. That very important. And as alluded to before, the UK government has very high aspirations to get this level up. We also provide a lot of landside facilities for the tourism industries, recreation industries, and other services to the maritime community, including fuel and services. And ports estates, of course, they are can be big land areas with lots of tenants on board, and very useful for creating economic activities and jobs, etc. Next slide, please. So free ports, what are they? They're quite a traditional thing. A lot of historic examples of free ports around the world. A lot of people know or have an idea about what they think a free port is, but traditionally they have very much focused on customs-free zones. And we have been pushing the UK government as a trade body to kind of revisit them, not necessarily on the custom side so much, but more around the enterprise stimulus, the planning easements, and other bits and bobs that you can make a business-friendly environment around a port cluster. And we were delighted to see that in 2019, the UK general election, the Conservative Party, who of course won the election, had a manifesto commitment to push forward a three ports policy. The only negative for us was that it was for 10, which is rather stole our thunder somewhat, because we as an association, you would have seen the stats at the beginning, we represent a real wide range of different types of ports. So just 10 is rather limiting. So we're a little bit concerned that this excellent vision of what ports may only be limited to certain regions. But anyway, we're working with that, and the government has indicated that it may be interested in or inclined to open out this policy further, but that is something we'll just have to wait and see if it comes to fruition. Next slide, please. So what are they? Just to recap, I did mention a lot of focus on custom side things, but they effectively can cover all manner of types of port activity, from taxation of investments, etc., or other enterprise stimulus, or included our fast track planning, which I'll come to some of the details in a minute. They're not about creating a race to the bottom where you just scrap every regulation under the sun. There is still going to be a regulatory framework, but it's about making the systems work better for the operators to encourage inward investment, growth and development. And on size, there's some points there about what the zones may look like in the UK that the UK government has recently announced in its bidding prospectus. So 25 to 45 kilometres for custom sides, and 300 to 600 hectares on the tax side. So relatively limited for some, others think that's just about right. Next slide, please. So just to briefly run through each of the areas, the key areas at least. So on the custom side, what you'll be able to do is create a zone where you suspend the requirements for customs, documentation, declarations, etc. But also you can defer tariff payments, etc. So you could bring things in under a customs-free status and potentially turn it into something else at a manufacturing facility and then re-export it without it ever having touched the customs territory of the UK. Or you could bring things in, turn it into something, and then ship it internally into the rest of the UK, and potentially you could do that at a lower duty than it was originally brought in, because you've turned it into something else, a finished product, etc. And of course that means that, as well as it being beneficial for certain types of cargo and manufacturing activities, it also means you bring things like jobs and facilities closer to ports potentially, and that in the UK is very important, because a lot of our ports are in areas of high deprivation, in need of investment and growth stimulation. So they are seen as a very good tool for the government's levelling up agenda, which it's keen to roll out. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, stimulating investment, effectively, you could have these sort of enterprise zone type stimulus where you effectively provide zones which have things like reduced business rates, preferential tax and national insurance contributions for employees, and other things like capital allowances on property and land investments, as well as purchasing rules and other things on employment, which all factored in could make this far more attractive for people to set up in a free zone area around a port. And as I said before, that is something that those regions very much would welcome. Now, there would be a bit of a challenge here in that you would find other regions may not like these, because if they haven't been selected, they would be concerned that there might be some kind of displacement. But the focus very much from the UK government is, at the moment anyway, about new growth, new development, and things like offshore wind are potentially an area where they're looking at. Next slide, please. So on planning, effectively, you can also factor in, as well as those very much fiscal measures and tax measures, you can also factor in things like fast track planning and consenting rules, where you can move development schemes through at a quicker pace and have a lighter touch planning regime. However, as I said right at the beginning, this is not about ripping up rules, and certainly the planning regimes will stay in place. What we're talking about is things like permitted development, and in the UK, the ports industry often has permitted developments up to certain thresholds, and these certain changes are coming through from the government alongside the Freeports initiative, which would broaden those planning permitted development right options out to a slightly wider type of thing, so you could do a bit more. But they're not broadening out the thresholds too much more, and they're certainly not bypassing things like the environmental impact assessment process, meaning that although the planning rules are very helpful, effectively they're probably not the most radical, and certainly they don't touch other things like marine consenting. Final thing to say is plugging port master plans in. So UK ports have guidance on developing master plans, effectively getting their strategies out there for all to see. We might see a bit more of a boost for that, with port master plans getting some kind of more regional or indeed national recognition, so that geographical planners and transport bodies can start to build in port priorities into longer term national and regional strategies. Next slide, please. Now, they also, Freeports potentially will broaden out into sort of, as I mentioned before, job creation and sort of skills type development, and working with local colleges and educational providers. There's an opportunity to bring in local skills, etc., which is very much what they're about. But also a lot of focus on innovation, and startups particularly would welcome some of these things like preferential business rates and plugging sites into local transport networks and some of the employment incentives, which would really help them take off. And we're talking about particularly maritime innovation, so things connected with ports and shipping, but also just general innovation. So startups of all type and size will be welcomed to come and set up base at certain free ports. Now, no port will be the same, of course, and you may find that certain ports have particular focus on various things, such as data or automation or other technologically minded initiatives. But finally, transport links, you may find that because these will be a flagship policy, free ports may need better transport networking and plugging into national networks if they have seen that things are lacking. And traditionally that is provided by the UK government, but you may find that there's an element of industry contribution being encouraged through these things, alongside some of the seed funding that the government has committed to establish these things. Next page, please. So just quickly on the timescales, February the 5th is when bidding closes, and during the spring, government and ministers will decide the locations and announce things over the summer, I presume, with free ports potentially functioning this time next year or early 2022. We're not sure how many yet, but as I said before, there was a commitment to have 10, but it's probably going to be a handful more, subject to the bids being suitable. Next slide, please. There's a lot of questions, of course, about where the locations are going to be, and of course that we do have ports policy in the UK is devolved. So this is very much a UK-led policy, and the bidding prospectus I mentioned is actually England only, although with the intention that the UK government want the Northern Irish, Scottish and Welsh Assembly governments to follow suit, although depending on which part of the UK, and there's a bit of reluctance to fully embrace a different political organisation or party's policy. So people are looking at that at the moment, and indeed the Scottish government are currently consulting in a very reactionary way, looking at potentially having a small sort of enterprise zone approach across all Scottish ports instead of just picking one or two locations. But that is something we need to watch. BPI, of course, is a trade body with a membership, a diverse range of members from the largest ports down to some of the smallest, who certainly won't be applicable, won't be expected they'll be applying. We have to remain location neutral, although obviously we'll be promoting our members' interests over those who are not in the trade body, of course. But we do want to see a fair and transparent process without some of the potential things such as political donations and the government wanting to strategically cite free ports in areas that it wants to do well at elections, for example. And so we're pressing our friends in government to be careful and wary of that, to make sure that the process is as clear as and open as possible, and not be undermined with any accusations or criticism. But the final point is, and we had a quick conversation with Simon, who follows me shortly, about this. Will they actually achieve their aims? I mean, I think it's an exciting strategy for some, but you know, we have seen free ports in the past in the UK, although albeit just focused on customs easements. And although they started off with quite a lot of vim and vigour in the 1980s, they effectively kind of wound down by 2012, when the last sites lost their licenses, because you can actually achieve a lot of these easements already through our HMRC, our customs authority. But factoring in the things like the planning, the business, the tax in there as well, then we would expect there would be certain benefits, etc. But perhaps they won't achieve things overnight, and perhaps it's going to be a gradual process, but only time will tell. Next slide. So coming to the end of my presentation here, a lot of interest in where the locations are. As I said right at the beginning, this is not just about seaports. You can also, heaven forbid, you can be an airport or a rail hub or a logistics park even, and apply for this status. So we are seeing a lot of interest and potential joint bids as well with seaports, both with other ports, but also with airports, etc. So there's a list. It's not definitive, and not everybody is out, you know, in public on this. But effectively, this is where people are taking a bit of an interest, and you will see, you know, there's some locations close to the Republic of Ireland, in both Northern Ireland and the west coast of Scotland, England, and indeed Wales. So lots of interest. You will quickly deduce that there's a lot more than 10 or 10 plus. So it tells you there's going to be a lot of interest. And indeed, as we looked at the 1980s process back in '83, it has been established that during that bidding process, which was for just 3 sites originally, which was broadened out later, there were 63 applicants at that time. So a lot of unhappy people who felt they lost out, and that's something we need to bear in mind. But there we go. So I think that's it for me. That was my penultimate. So the final slide, please, is just my contact details. If you want to get in touch, if you just click forward, please, then yeah, and one more. And if you want to find out a little bit more, there's a Freeports hub there, effectively, with some of the latest news, links to things like the bidding prospectus and 1 or 2 other things there. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Richard. It was a very, very interesting presentation, especially all that's happening with Freeports. I think it's a very exciting initiative, and Ireland will certainly be watching with interest. I'll just remind the attendees, if you want to submit questions, we'll have Q&A at the end, so you can do that via the questions tab on the right of your screen. And without further ado, we'll move on to our second speaker, Simon Brett of Port of Tyne.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simon Brett. I'm the Commercial Director for the Port of Tyne. My specific responsibilities at the port are around offshore wind and dry bulks. I have other colleagues that work alongside me who are more versed in Freeports and environmental challenges. But I'm going to try and give you a flavour this afternoon of all 3 areas that we're looking for and looking at, and how we're going to adapt to the future challenges that face us from the beginning of 2021. I've been with the port since May 2019, prior to which I spent 27 years working for another ports company in the UK. Have the next slide, please. So, main areas to touch on: importance of maritime in the sector, particularly in the northeast. The maritime sector accounts for 95% of our imports and exports by volume. There's a large number of people employed around the UK. The port itself employs just over 300 people now. This has reduced over the last few years, but still there's a significant multiplier effect of that employed in the northeast of England, based around the port itself. We're a significant contributor of GVA into the regional economy of the Tyne, and a key enabler of a lot of businesses. The Tyneside region has a higher percentage of manufacturing as part of its economy than anywhere else in the UK. So a lot of that business uses the port either directly or indirectly. So the next slide, please. So around the UK, there are a number of recognised maritime clusters, and just for ease sake, we're number 7 up in the northeast of England. The cluster in the northeast of England very much specialises in, as I said, on manufacturing, but also in offshore. The Tyne had a long history of supporting the oil and gas sector, and prior to that, it was heavily involved in shipbuilding. And you can still see a lot of remnants of the region's old shipbuilding industry as you traverse the Tyne up the river at the moment. A lot of these facilities have been redeveloped for housing, but a lot of them are now being redeveloped and brought back into economic use. And it's this expertise that supported the offshore sector that has enabled the region to transition from the offshore oil and gas sector to the offshore wind sector. We're a little bit behind some of our competitor ports in terms of the transition. However, we have a far better opportunity that's available, a unique opportunity in the northeast of England, and we'll discuss that in a bit more detail as we go on. So the next slide, please. Just a quick aerial view of what the port looks like. The mouth of the port, obviously, out at the River Tyne, at Tynemouth, between the groins. And you only have to travel about 1.5 miles up the river to get to the deep water berths on the south side. These berths can accommodate vessels of up to 13 meters draft at all states of the tide. So deepest port anywhere on the northeast, well, on the east coast of England and Scotland, from Nig down to the Thames. We also have facilities on the north side supporting ferry services and a lot of automotive, but we anticipate significant changes over the next few years as we look to redevelop this business and move away from what was a very traditional bulks handling port into a port that will be fit for the 21st century. So the next slide, please. So our key business areas are bulks. We do, despite coming out of coal at the end of this year, we still do a lot of other bulk products. In particular, we do a lot of biomass products for Drax Power Station and Linemouth Power, with a northern centre of import for the Volkswagen Group, as well as being the Nissan port of export for the Sunderland factory, which is about 5 miles from the dock estate. We have an increasing number of containers coming into the UK, and interestingly, in the last few weeks, we have seen a real increase in the number of units coming through the port and inquiries into next year, as that we expect that to grow quite considerably as a result of Brexit. Cruise and ferry business has been decimated this year by the COVID situation. We've had no cruise vessels and a very skeleton ferry service. The ferry service has adapted from being freight and passengers to being almost entirely freight. As I say, no cruise business for what is the third biggest cruise port in the UK. Renewables we see as our growth sector, and that activity goes very much hand in hand with taking advantage of the large land holdings that we have in our estates and supported by our unique marine infrastructure. So for the next slide, please. We've had a policy over the last few months of Tyne 2050, which we'll talk about in a minute, but we've been looking at our critical connectivity infrastructure, working on initiatives with other parties on how we can improve road and rail links and look to coastal shipping as we come out of Brexit. Our marine infrastructure is modern and will require some amendment to it to take advantage of the larger and accommodate the largest offshore installation vessels. But one of our key offerings is our work on digital infrastructure and the Tyne 2050 Innovation Hub. And one of the reasons why we were selected as the O&M base for the Dogger Bank offshore wind farm was our forethought in looking at digital infrastructure and how we can put this into place with our new tenants. Can we go on, please? Tyne 2050 Innovation Hub was launched in July 2019. It was the first maritime innovation hub that was launched in the United Kingdom in response to the government's Maritime 2050 initiative. Want to move on, please? It's taken a lot of activities in terms of marine. Sorry, I thought there was another slide here. It's a lot of marine, environment, electrical, electronic, digital, land use planning, and customer and HR focused policies within the Tyne 2050. And it's all about putting the port in its best position possible to take the future for the area. So in terms of Brexit, the challenges that we are currently facing, obviously around physical infrastructure and customs, looking to have new customs facilities in place by the end of June next year to enable particularly RoRo activity to continue. Obviously, a lot of the infrastructure was undone over the last 19 years when we came out at the end of 1992. Impacts on customers and throughput. We're beginning to see, as I said earlier, change in the pattern of business, potentially moving away from further south, coming into northern ports. Lots of inquiries for business that would have driven through the tunnel or on the cross-channel tunnel ferries, potentially now looking to come further north. There is a high degree of market uncertainty, though, with a lot of our customers, and we do await with a lot of interest what happens, not just in the next 24 hours, but over particularly the next 6 months. And final comment on there is Freeports, but I know there's a slide on Freeports. So can we go on, please? So post-Brexit, I've already mentioned that the northeast of England has the highest concentration of manufacturing in the UK. So getting the system right for the northeast of England is crucial. All of those containers that you can see there on the South Shields container terminal are all destined for manufacturers in the northeast of England. The interchange of containers to companies such as Nissan, Komatsu and Hitachi is very, very quick. A lot of these are just-in-time deliveries into stock holding facilities and the factories themselves. We also do offer some destuffing activity on the port for slower moving commodities, which some of these customers also take. One of the things that we're working on at the moment, particularly, is the requirement for additional inspection facilities, and they will be based on the North Bank where the ferry is currently based. But we have agreement to link that through into the container terminal on the south side. We are seeing that digital community is going to be more important, and we're working closely with our digital providers on making sure that our systems are the most modern and up-to-date systems that are available on the market to enable goods to continue to flow in and out of the port in a post-Brexit environment. Next slide, please. So Freeports, our approach to Freeports is very much alongside what Richard said, and we're looking at a partnership approach with IAMP, Nissan and the Port of Blythe to take advantage of the geographical area. We believe that this partnership approach will give us a virtual Freeport and will particularly support IAMP and Nissan in the efficient operations of the factory at Sunderland. We're looking at this again largely based around the digital nature of the Freeport status, although we do have large swathes of land which we're also offering to put into the Freeport status to support the offshore wind sector, and we'll see a bit more of that in a minute. So Freeports, yes, we will be submitting our bid at the beginning of February, as Richard said, and we very much hope that the decision will go in our favour, largely because of the strong manufacturing base in the northeast of England. Next slide, please. One of the elements that we're working on very much at the moment, particularly under Tyne 2050, is embarking upon a green recovery programme. This is the transition of the port away from the historical way of doing things, diesel trucks, heavy reliance on coal, lots of lorries coming into the port, in favour of now looking at ways of increasing traffic in and out of the port by rail, putting green systems in, embedded generation, shore power, making the port all electric by 2040, and as I say, having embedded generation. All of this is now being wrapped up and into our key programme of Tyne Clean Energy Park. So can I have the next slide, please? So Tyne Clean Energy Park is really a big offering for the offshore wind industry, and we see this as crucial for the northeast of England and the Tyne going forward. So for the next slide, please. Tyne Clean Energy Park is basically 5 areas of land across the port, and you can see those land holdings highlighted on this plan. There are 2 sites, Whitehill Point and Howden Yard and Quay on the north bank, and 3 sites on the south side, Tyne Renewables Quay, Riverside Quay and Tyne Dock Enterprise Park. In total, there's over 200 acres of land available at these sites, and they range from just short of 100 acres in size at Tyne Renewables Quay, down to about 10 acres at Whitehill Point, at Tyne Dock Enterprise Park. But each site can be configured for a specific reason and a specific need within the market. We do believe that Freeport application will greatly assist on these, and particularly at Tyne Renewables Quay, we are looking at offering this up as a major home for manufacturing of offshore components. Next slide, please. So on the south side, we will be looking at repurposing the bulks terminal. That work will start in earnest by the end of Q1 next year, and putting in a large port facility that will be able to not only support assembly, pre-assembly and installation activity, but also, if required, it can be the home of a manufacturing facility. The vessel that you can see in the middle of the picture is a simulation of a vessel called the Voltaire, which is the largest size of installation craft, which is currently on the keel being built in the Far East. This ship is a beam of 59 meters and has a draft of 10 meters, 10.5 meters, and this vessel can be accommodated at all states of tide in the port of Tyne. Also on the south side to the left of the picture, you can see the Tyne Dock Enterprise Park site, and this was the site that was selected by Equinor and SSE to be the O&M home for Dogger Bank, which is the largest wind farm that's going to be built within UK waters. Both of these facilities, we're looking at key upgrades. We've let we're out to tender on some of the work at the moment. We've let other works due to start in January, and in total on the south side, we'll be bringing forward 120 acres of land, which will become operational from the beginning of 2022. Next one, please. On the north side, we have two sites. We have Whitehill Point and Howden. This is the site at Howden. It's being earmarked for O&M activity, whether that's SOVs or whether it's for cables, we don't mind. We've put a grant application into the North Tyne Combined Authorities to upgrade this. This site was originally constructed and upgraded in 2010 as part of the Tyne Tunnel 2 works, but it hasn't been used since it was upgraded. It needs a bit of a further work, it needs dredging. The shed on site needs a bit of upgrade as well. But this site could be operational by the beginning of 2022. And we very much see this as being important to support the existing manufacturers on the north side of the River Tyne. Next one, please. We're looking at this as a long-term development. Phase 1, setup, preparation, supply chain establishment, build and installation. We started that in June this year with the works to clear Tyne Dock Enterprise Park. And we believe that that will take anywhere between 3 and 5 years. Phase 2 is when operations maintenance will kick in. We anticipate this starting in 2023, looking at data and efficiency. And then we're already planning the port for phase 3, which is the replacement and decommissioning of critical components within offshore wind turbines, and also eventually looking at decommissioning. And we're looking at going into partnership with some of our existing companies on how we can undertake decommissioning activities on the port estate. Next slide. So as I said, phase 1 is underway. This is a slightly older image of what Tyne Dock Enterprise Park will look like. In addition to the Dogger Bank O&M base, which will commence construction next year, we're also looking at repurposing the rest of the site for supply chain activity. Experience has shown in other ports in the UK, such as Grimsby, Barrow and Lowestoft, that when you get an O&M supplier into the site or customer into the site, then a lot of its supply chain activity wants to co-locate within a very, very close proximity to that facility. And we have a strong pipeline of offshore opportunities that support the O&M activity that's being developed at the port by Equinor. Next one, please. So the opportunities for the port are to provide manufacturing activities, installation, the combined effect of having 50 acres of land plus 12 meters minimum of draft alongside is fairly unique in the UK. There are not many sites like this. We're not for 1 minute proposing that the Port of Tyne is the only port that takes on this type of activity. The requirement by the government to install 40 gigawatts into UK waters by the end of 2030 means that the facilities will need to be developed at the Port of Tyne in the same way as they will need to continue to be developed on the Humber and in Teesport. So there is opportunities for all ports, and working very, very closely with other ports up and down the East Coast, not just in construction and manufacturing, but also in supply chain activity, and such as Blythe. That we believe there's a huge opportunity for interconnected ports going up and down the East Coast over the next few years. I think that's probably the last one. Next one, please. No, two others. So Port of Tyne is part of Energy Coast. Energy Coast is the regional offshore wind cluster for the northeast of England. We're proud members of Energy Coast and the work that they do to promote the offshore sector in this part of the world. And as you can see, it covers both the Tees and the Tyne. Next slide, please. It has a wide range of membership, developers, ports, supply chain, innovation, and local enterprise partnerships. And we very much support the work that NOF do on raising the profile of the offshore sector in the Northeast. There are similar organisations elsewhere, Team Humber Marine Alliance on the Humber, for instance, and without the work that these organisations do, we would be in a poorer place. So hats off to organisations such as NOF. Next one, please. And that's it. There we are. That's some questions later, I think.
Thank you very much, Simon. And yes, indeed, we will be having questions later. Thanks very much for your presentation. It was very interesting, especially about the digital developments that the Port of Tyne are introducing. There's a lot of chat about smart ports and that sort of thing these days, so we'll certainly come back to it. Right after our final speaker, Alan Duncan, who is the Director of Scotia Supply Chain and an offshore wind market expert. So I'll hand the floor over to you, Alan.
Okay, good afternoon, the Emerald Isle. Today, really, I'll spend about 15-20 minutes just kind of drawing together what the two gentlemen have talked through there, kind of very much the port context. I'll kind of draw it back a little bit to offshore wind, what that means. Yeah, we're happy to take questions at the end. So next slide, please. So I think in terms of agenda and background, what I'll cover today. So really that was the top left there was really what the WebEx pitch start. Really, I've kind of the highlight in green is really what I will cover. You know, the upcoming UK plans and corresponding supply chain needs. So I'll rattle through. The size of the UK prize from an offshore wind point of view. Some of you will have seen these slides before, but I'll just give a quick reminder of what that looks like. I'll touch upon some of the port requirements across the offshore wind life cycle. So again, very much depends what part of the life cycle you're targeting, whether it's O&M, Simon was talking about there, whether it's construction. So again, I'll touch upon that. Some opportunities, CapEx, OpEx, I'll talk about that. Again, some Irish supply chain thoughts, final thoughts, and then a Q&A. So that's really how I'll attack it today. So I think just as a little bit of background on myself. So, you know, I work across offshore wind supply chain for about 10 years now. So I'm a man of many hats. So I do advise governments, developers, tier one supply chain. I'm delighted to have been working with Enterprise Ireland for about 3 years now. Many companies, hopefully, on today I've spoken with in the past. And again, I've worked on the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, so I led the supply chain and cluster lead for that over the last 18 months or so. So that's kind of who I am. So I think just as a kind of general introduction, I've put the top right there. UK can be the Saudi Arabia of wind power. Again, I'm probably joking a little bit about that. We've got history in Scotland with that. Alex Salmond back in 2010 kind of suggested the very same. So I'm hoping it's not history repeating itself in 2020 with Mr. Johnson. But I think the sentiments are essentially correct, and I'll talk to these over the next few slides. Next slide, please. So a quick reminder, and again, I will make no apology up front that my slides are very busy. But generally, I'm trying to do that in such a way that, you know, the slides were made available for you, no need to take notes. So trying to cram as much information in that hopefully all of you will find useful. But again, as we talked about, the sector deal is now in place in the UK. I'll not talk a lot about that, but essentially a 30 gigawatt commitment by 2030. There's now a kind of 10 gigawatt upside, as was mentioned earlier, in the Conservative manifesto. So really looking at 40 gigawatts really by 2030, and really a mid-term forecast of 75 gigawatts by 2050. And I think that's one thing to note in the UK is, having been here for 10 years, it's very much gone from being, I think the industry's asked for a middle to long-term commitment, as it were. That's the one thing I've learned about wind, is if you're going to do this in bite-sized chunks, as it were, things like ports, etc., you just don't get the forward visibility to be able to make the investment. So this is exactly what's happened in the UK. If you like, the sector has earned its wings. It's dropped its cost. It's now essentially subsidy-free. So in return, the government is now kind of giving mid-term certainty. So this is really what you see here. And that's those kind of graphs on the left. You can see particularly the 40 gigawatts. We ain't seen nothing yet is really the message. Really from 2026 onwards, you can see essentially 4 gigawatts per year will need to go in the UK. And it's very, very conceivable, I think, that will happen. Again, a little bit small. I'm not going to go through it, but these projects down below, a number of these projects you'll recognise, and they kind of tier colour-coded, so you can see kind of where they're deployed above. But essentially, that's due to the latest projects we have here in the UK, Seagreen, Dogger Bank, and again, draw your attention to the fact a lot of these essentially went around about £40 per megawatt hour, which is essentially subsidy-free. But the takeaway in the UK really on offshore wind is 2025, we know what the market's going to look like, and that's really what you see there. Beyond that, and again, top right, you can really see there that the size of the challenge the UK is taking on here to change its energy mix. So by 2030, renewables has gone from a tiny sliver in 2005 to in 25 years. You can see that's pretty much a quarter of the power in the UK will come from offshore wind by the turn of the century. So, turn of the century, by the turn of the decade. So, you can see the size of the change that's afoot. So there's a 16 gigawatt pipeline beyond this. And the other thing to mention, we've got Scotland in a round 4 leasing round going on at the moment. Potentially that will release another 19 gigawatts of sites right round the UK. So really, the pipeline, I guess the message with this is the pipeline is there, to deliver what's on the left. And really, really exciting times. Some of the projects you can see down at the bottom in red there, but as I say, there'll be a brand new 19 gigawatts potentially 2021 comes on top of that with the 2 leasing rounds. Significant other things to remember, part of the sector deal, obviously, UK government's not just going to give out 40 gigawatts without something in return. So there is a commitment from the sector to deliver 60% UK content or GVA benefit by 2030. As a Irish supply chain, I guess I'm saying, you need to be aware of that there is a concerted effort, as there is in any market that's looking to deploy offshore wind, to look after its own supply chain to a certain element. On top of that, again, just to talk about, there's been I'm calling it 160 million government port bounty. So that's been announced in the UK of late. So there's a number of ports the length and breadth of the UK have been applying for this, particularly targeted at renewables. So again, I'll touch upon that later. But, as I said, it's the new Irish challenge. I guess, we've been here before. Ireland has had its challenges in the UK before, but, not something that, and I say that as a kind of third generation Irish descendant myself, not something we haven't faced. Next slide, please. So that's the size of the prize. Again, looking at the kind of top level estimate there, top point, Wind Europe, 70 gigawatts of offshore wind is really a conservative European estimate by 2030. What does that mean for ports? It's around about, half to €1 billion in upgrades, redesign, and adapting port facilities, across Europe in the next 10 years. That's an absolute minimum. It's expected this investment will see the emergence of consolidated multi-use renewable energy hubs for wind projects. And again, Port of Tyne, as I just talked through there, is exactly, case in point of that. Not going to go through my famous wheel on the left here, but again, just to remind, to where the money goes and to then consider, you know, what is the port role that it plays? And as I say, it does kind of play a part, whether it's from turbines supplying OEM through to balance of plant installation itself. Top right there, I've put the two zones in. So again, you know, it's very important if you're looking at UK ports, what are the horses to back? Where is this investment going to be? You really do need to look at, well, where are the wind farms? You know, which ones are likely to succeed when? You know, that pretty much dictates, you know, when ports will gear up for investing. Bottom right there, again, not going to try and cover that here, but you know, I thought it was quite a neat pictorial just to show, you know, there's around 17 different vessel types with 12 different operations required across an offshore wind farm. You know, I think people make the mistake of thinking O&M and a little bit of build out, but you know, I think they're just looking through there that shows you the vast array, whether it's in the DevEx res phase through to the OpEx phase, you know, a lot of ships and a lot of port requirements right across all phases of the offshore wind farm. Next slide, please. So just starting to think about some of the CapEx and OpEx port requirements. So I think the first point here was obviously, you know, depending on using Irish supply chain, you know, you need to be clear on what your interest on supplying UK ports is in terms of, I guess, dictating how you approach that. So I've tried to give just my view here, my perspective. So again, if your interest is kind of general port infrastructure, construction, you know, jetdrilling, quayside works, pontoons, etc. My feeling is, you know, your customer or who you're targeting is actually the port directly. You know, as the gentleman before we talked about, unlike in Europe, you know, there's a slight disadvantage the UK has, is that we're competing against European markets where a lot of the ports are owned in public infrastructure. So a lot of OEMs get kind of free, very generous terms to have portside infrastructure. Unfortunately, we as an industry or as a country, it's private. So we need to make that investment. These public ports need to make that investment. It's not kind of delivered to them on a plate. So, you know, very much, if that is your area of interest, you know, contact the ports directly, because these guys very much are the masters of their own destiny, rather than development or the state kind of ploughing it in. So if that's your area of interest, you know, contacts the ports directly. If your interest is project specific, you know, installation, say, you know, vessels, installation support, really then your customer, I would say, is from a turbine point of view, is contact the WTMs directly. Foundations generally reverts to the developer. Developers generally take on kind of balance of plant responsibility from early on, so they would be your point of contact. If your interest is kind of project or developer specific onshore O&M infrastructure, you know, the O&M centre, so generally every wind farm you'll see, they will build an onshore O&M centre. So again, very good interest for a lot of those, a strong Irish capability and be able to supply that. Again, if that's your interest, I would point you towards the developer rather than the port itself. You know, the developer generally takes responsibility for building his O&M centre at each of the wind farms. But as I say, most of these ones, every port, every project that we use will be building that to a greater or lesser extent. And I think the last thing, if your interest is kind of project-specific asset operation, you know, O&M, etc. Again, if your customer is turbines, I would generally point you towards the wind turbine manufacturer, and again, balance of plant more the developer. Reason being, turbines generally have a kind of 10 to 15 warranty, so generally, you know, the Siemens, the MVOWs will be the customer for that type of supply, whereas balance of plant reverts to the developer. So just delving into the kind of splits here. So CapEx, as I've said here, so this is not a wee health warning here. This is not intended to be any particular port saying you've missed me. You know, this is just my kind of look across the sector, just a little bit of a heat map to kind of look at, you know, what ports are landing what in the UK at the moment. So that's that first table on the left. You know, so there's 12 offshore wind projects with a total capacity of just under 12 gigawatts, officially in the construction phase at the moment. You know, add to that the 8.5 already installed, so that takes us to 20 gigawatts by 2025. So at least 9 UK ports will be used to construct these 12 projects. And again, some projects yet to communicate. But that table above, I think, gives you a very interesting, you know, of the kind of, if you like, the 2025 projects, that's the kind of the winners and riders, as I say. So kind of split into three. Turbine, so as you know, these ports mentioned here. So I'm very quickly looking for Port of Tyne here. There it is. So you can look at Port of Tyne. Turbine has been landed on one. Some for jackets. So Nig's landed a jacket contract, as is Grimsby. So again, just a little bit of a ready reckoner there. So again, what you can see is the O&M. You can see like Tyne are picking up a lot of the O&M contracts, as was talked about previously. Fraserburgh, Lowestoft. So again, just a little bit of a ready reckoner for the UK for 2025. That's a good heat map in terms of what ports will be used to do what. Flipping to OPEX, I think that the key thing, and I think one of the gentlemen touched on it before, one of the things that's going to change quite dramatically in the offshore wind sector is a move to what we call SOVs, or the big service operation vessels, rather than the kind of small 12-man, 24-man CTV. Essentially because wind farms are going a lot further offshore. So you can see the graphic I've dropped in there. You know, you're going to see that SOV, that orange part, grow quite dramatically, whereas everything is CTV at the moment. So as I've said there's 18 UK ports will be used to service the project so far nominated, and significantly, 60% of the ports are private. And analysis shows that trust ports tend to only be used for single projects, sometimes two. So again, it's just an interesting dynamic, but what you will see is a vast array of O&M ports, predominantly on the east coast, but we'll be starting to open up on the west coast. And again, very, very significant for Ireland as Ireland starts to think about its own journey in initially the Irish Sea, and then obviously down the south and out the west. So again, if you can look to the right there, again, I've just put a little bit of a heat map from an OPEX point of view. You can see where some of the kind of single-use type ports, the Wicks, the Peterboroughs, the Aberdeen not only used once, but there's some projects really coming to the fore. As you can see, the northeast, no surprise there. Barrow, Grimsby, Great Yarmouth, a lot of multiple projects going to be coming through. So again, if your interest is more of an O&M bent, these are the ports that we should take your interest. Next slide, please. Maybe I'll click that again. I thought I've done something strange with the graphics here. Click next slide. Oh, no, I don't know what I've done. Sorry, I've made a bit of a mess with that table there. That's what happens when you're asked to put a late slide in. Essentially, all I was trying to do here was just give you a little bit of ready reckoner, and what I'll do, I'll put the OEM one in before we send these out. But essentially, it was just kind of looking at, what are the kind of minimum port considerations or requirements. So again, OEM one you can't see there, but looking at O&M from a CTP point of view, generally water depth, you kind of need 3 to 4 meters, distance to shore, really from a CTV point of view, you're reaching your limit at kind of 75 kilometers. So again, the key thing to really take away from that is if you're looking to become an O&M port that's CTV, you don't really need that much on land space. You don't really need a lot of quayside space. So, the entry barrier, if you like, is relatively low. Interestingly, as you move to kind of SOV, obviously, as you'd expect for these vessels, you need that little bit extra kind of water depth, generally 7 to 8 meters. Again, obviously, as you would expect, the distance to the wind farm is then extended quite considerably. So again, if you're kind of into up to 150 kilometers would generally be a range. But the key thing there is you're then starting to need a little bit more kind of harbour width, quayside length for these bigger SOVs, and possibly a little bit more onshore kind of sheltered space, etc. But again, apologies, that wasn't a good slide, but it was just really to give you an idea what kind of criteria dictates what ports are needed for which operation. Next slide, please. So again, just to give a kind of Irish slant, as I say, my thoughts on and again, I'm kind of hopefully got another 5 minutes here, so I'll spend a little bit of time on this one because I think it's important. So as I said earlier, it's largely an East Coast play at the moment. The West Coast of the UK will open up a little bit with the Scotland round on the West Coast, with the round 4 stuff. But, fundamentally at the moment, in the 2020s, the real growth port market is the East Coast. So from an operating wind farm point of view, a lot of the port infrastructure is already made. So you really, if you're thinking about the 8.5 gigawatts it's in, a lot of that infrastructure is already serviced. There will be some incremental investment, but a lot of that infrastructure is already there. Small trust ports tend to only support 1 or 2 projects, unlikely to be investing in infrastructure to attract new projects. Largest opportunity for Irish companies is like to be that, the bigger private ports that have the bandwidth to attract new projects going forward, like Port of Tyne, as Simon's just gone through. Significant to note, a move away from CTV to SOV. So again, this does change the O&M strategy, and it does change the port and onshore dry side requirements. Again, you don't need as much onshore land, if you like, or warehouse space if the vessel's only coming in every 2 to 3 weeks. So, it does change the requirement a little bit. So the key takeaway, infrastructure investment is most likely at 3 private ports: Great Yarmouth, Barrow, Lowestoft. They all have CTV and SOV capabilities. Ramsgate's the only public CTV with an operating wind farm that may invest in the future. So again, this is not an exclusive list. It's just my view of looking at where the market's coming for, size of these ports, and what they might be used for. In terms of the construction opportunity, so I think it's significant no UK port has managed to secure more than 1 construction commission for the next 5 years. So again, the work does tend to get shared around a little bit. Only the ports of Grimsby and Tyne have secured construction as well as O&M port commissions, and are the only ports to secure more than 1 individual project. So again, I'm not saying which horse to back, but again, you can see the ports that are based on their geography, based on their capability, based on what they've already announced in terms of ambition. You can see where the opportunity is going to be. Key takeaway: so from a construction port perspective, a number of Scottish ports have announced intent to invest in dry side infrastructure, including Dundee, Nigg, and Invergordon. South of the border, I think Abel, Seaton, and the Port of Tyne have confirmed infrastructure investment in place. So again, from a construction point of view, I think these will be the hot to trot ports in the UK. Operation of next generation wind farms, with less projects employing CTV, the wet side port infrastructure spend, i.e. pontoons, etc., will potentially be a little bit less going forward. Projects employing SOVs will still require CTVs, but there is a different kind of infrastructure requirement that doesn't need as much of the wet side investment. So I think from an O&M port perspective, the only ports not to be investing in CTV related port infrastructure at the moment are Eyemouth and Fraserburgh. Dry side port infrastructure investment is confirmed at Lowestoft, Fraserburgh, Eyemouth, and Port of Tyne, and investment at Grimsby significantly progressed. So again, just wanted to give you, don't want to be rude to any port, but that's just a little bit of my view on kind of hot to trot and where are the hot ports at the moment. So next slide, please. So thankfully, you've made it through the end of my diatribe. So just some final thoughts from me. A big Scottish eye for an Irish offshore wind cluster. So this is something I've been working with Dara, Liam, and Jack for a while, and great that Simon mentioned it there at the end of the Port of Tyne. Essentially clusters and an Irish offshore wind cluster is absolutely the way to go with this. You can see Energy Coast that Simon talked about. Essentially UK ports, in my opinion, are the spiritual epicenters of the cluster model. You're not going to have a cluster in offshore wind that doesn't centre around a port. So very similarly, the graphic, the bottom right there, that Simon showed for Port of Tyne, this is another example for the Forth and Tay in this case. And again, really just what I wanted to put there, it's just this idea of the port is the absolute epicenter for all of these different, whether it's kind of upfront DevEx stuff, whether it's, kind of installation, turbine. It really is the idea of a cluster and coming together like this is the way, if you like, the port can get the economies of scale to make the investments that are required, to kind of, whether it's OEM, whether it's operations and maintenance, but really the cluster is absolutely key to guys like the Port of Tyne, as Simon said. So just the last thing for me to as a takeaway, some of you will have seen this slide before, for me, this is really about articulating Irish strengths and partnering to mitigate weaknesses. So again, this is some work I've done before where, looking at where is Ireland strong, etc. And this is essentially the challenge at hand. Looking at the UK market is is really to look at the UK market. You know, given that there's some UK content restrictions, etc., it's a good idea to sometimes look at partnering on UK projects. And again, the thing that Enterprise Ireland are probably sick of me saying now, but the whole idea with this is, you know, the UK market is the biggest market in the world. To get in there, earn your stripes on the UK market, with a thing in the back of the mind that the Irish market is now coming along next, and any partnerships, almost you scratch my back, I scratch yours. You know, getting a foothold in the UK market allows partnerships for you to reciprocate that when the Irish market and port investment happens over there. But that's probably me. A couple of minutes over time. I'll probably wrap it up there, but happy to give you a whistle-stop tour. Please get in touch if my Scottish got too quick there and half of that you didn't catch, but I'm happy to clarify anything if you get in touch.
Thanks very much, Alan. That was very, very interesting. And as you mentioned, we will be circulating the slides afterwards, so there's a lot of important information there, so don't worry, we will be sending out the slides after the webinar. We will move on into the Q&A part of the webinar now. And I'll remind the attendees, if they want to submit any questions, you can do so via the chat function. I know that some people are having trouble using the questions function, but there's also a chat function which you can use to contribute. I guess to kick things off, there was a question put in by Liam, just kind of touching on what you brought up there, Alan, about the kind of developments for offshore wind and how that will impact the future of how a port would look like, particularly with SOVs replacing CTVs, as you outlined. How will these ports develop, especially like taking into consideration these changes? Will there be separate construction ports and O&M ports as per now, or do people see a hybrid port emerging? So maybe Alan, if you want to start off, and then
yeah, I would maybe kick that off, and I'll tee this up beautifully for Simon to come in, because yeah, essentially it is, if you like, what Port of Tyne are looking at there. You know, the key to this is going to be, if you like, is this multi-use port. So it's this idea, you know, it's not about just becoming an offshore wind port or an oil and gas port. I think, you know, if you look at the Port of Tyne example, it's about coming to the market. I guess the dilemma you've got, it's almost the Kevin Costner Field of Dreams dilemma. If you build it, they will come. So there's this chicken and egg. It's about, do ports make the investment and nail their colours to a mast, but going after a particular manufacturing capability or O&M. But I think my answer is, and probably good to tee up both other gentlemen, is I think the key to this is, as Port of Tyne are doing, is say, look guys, this is what we have. We've got 200 hectares here. These are the water that, you know, we can accept any of the vessels you want to throw at us. So it's about putting it to the market and really letting the market decide, if you like, whether it wants kind of O&M capacity, whether it wants, you know, and this is the other thing, because one of the things that the UK and Ireland will need to consider as well is we're passionate about getting more CapEx local content. Ergo, that means you've got to attract OEM, you've got to attract manufacturers. And again, that's something that Simon touched upon there. It's about making land available to people that maybe manufacture towers or jackets or foundations or nacelles, to say, well, look, here is what we've got. We're doing a bit of pre-development. So it's a little bit of a vague answer I've given there, but hand over to the gentleman now. But I think the key is, as the Port of Tyne and other ports are doing, is targeting a multi-use market.
Okay. Prior to joining Port of Tyne, I used to work for ABP on the Humber. In the mid-2000s, we started to develop Grimsby as an O&M facility. And then I moved across to Hull in 2013 and was the project director for Greenport Hull. And both of those, really, Grimsby was just an O&M facility. Greenport Hull was a manufacturing and installation facility with O&M capacity. But both of those were sort of relatively limited in terms of where they go as installation craft now get larger and larger and larger. What I think to back up what Alan's said, you're going to get to the stage now where you're going to have a very, very small number of very large ports that can take the very large installation craft, and it may be South Humber, it may be on Teesside, it may be on Port of Tyne, and then it may be up in Nig in Scotland on the east coast. And excuse me, I don't know my Irish ports geography well enough to comment on what could be built in Ireland. But you're going to have probably opportunities for 3 or 4 mega port hubs that can take O&M manufacturing and assembly and installation activity. There will be a requirement to support those, particularly on the O&M side, with more, let's call it regional ports. So there'll always be a place for the Eyemouths, the Blythes, the Forths, the Grimsbys, the Lowestofts, the Barrows in Cumbria, which remember that O&M activity has to be far, far closer to the actual end port than the installation activity or the manufacturing activity. It's all to do with the economies of shipping. So Port of Tyne is quite unique, probably one of 3 or 4 that can actually do both, and we are setting ourselves up to offer the opportunity to do both. So we've got the O&M side in already. We've already got the manufacturing side in. The port is bigger than just the Port of Tyne's land holdings. We've got third-party operators within the larger Port of Tyne, such as Smulders, who operate a manufacturing and fabrication facility at a Wallsend for jackets. You've then got Shepherd's, and there's a whole set of activities around there, and then not forgetting the ability to do dry docking, etc., A&P. So the beauty about the Port of Tyne is you've got all of these interrelated activities, not just Port of Tyne owned activities, but Port of Tyne operated, but wider third-party activities as well. And as I said in my presentation, they will eventually go out and connect to the likes of Sunderland, connect to the likes of Blythe, to create these much, much larger regional hubs where different bespoke activities will be located at different berthing facilities. Our berths in the Port of Tyne are very different from Sunderland's or from Blythe's, and therefore you don't necessarily always compete. You complement, and I think that's what you've got to have going forward.
Simon, can I just add, and Alan, it was really interesting to hear your presentation, but from the sort of national view, just to kind of throw the cat amongst the pigeons a little bit, Alan, you talked about UK content being one of those aspirations of under the offshore wind sector deal. 60% sounds great, of course, but there's absolutely no, it's an aspiration. There's no mandatory requirement for this. And what's to stop, kind of offshore developers just continuing, as they have done very much previously, using, a little bit of mobilisation in the UK, and of course operation and maintenance, because they're nice and close for some of them smaller ports, some of them big ports like Tyne, of course. But why don't they just continue to use Esbjerg and the big European hubs unless we really start to mandate it? That's why I'm saying cat amongst the pigeons, Alan, because effectively, we're behind the curve a little bit really in the UK, aren't we? And there's no, we've got Brexit coming, we might be able to do a few things, we might have a free port and speed up planning, etc. But really, is there going to be anything unless we start to really look at requiring this as a planning condition that people actually have to go through UK ports, the supply chain, etc. Is that something? What's your view on that?
Yeah, no, listen, you're absolutely right, and I guess it's the first example of exactly the point you mentioned there is Scotland. So that's a good example. So the Scotland leasing round in Scotland here at the moment, that's the first commercial scale wind farm in the world that they're actually mandating local content before they will give the developer the leasing rights. So you're absolutely right. At the moment, the sector, you'll give out a lease. The only kind of hold is at the point of applying for a CFD. So when you're going for a CFD, that's where you need to kind of commit to a local content. But Richard, you're absolutely right. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with Scotland, because to your point, to actually mandate it at the leasing stage, it'll be interesting to see what happens in Scotland next year, because that's exactly what you've said. But in general, I think there is a level of scepticism about whether can we. The simple fact I would say is the government now at least has a binding commitment with developers that by 2030 it needs to be evidenced £1 comes back to the UK. So you're absolutely right. There's no punitive measures at the moment, but I feel I would be a brave developer to take on a wind farm now and not deliver that by 2030. I think you'd be in for. I don't think you'd get awarded very many sites after that. So, whilst I think we're allowed to be a little bit sceptical about how we push developers to do that, my feeling is for the first time I think there will be a conscious drive. But your point is absolutely right. And as Simon talked about there, you can only take O&M so far. So to get to 60% UK content, we can't just do the O&M. The UK's done the sums, if you like. We can't just do the low-hanging fruit anymore. Give it an O&M port, little bits and pieces. So to get to 60%, more capex needs to come from the UK. Therefore, that's why I think it's kind of hand in glove with this £160 million port fund, etc. Is to say, well, look, if we need more capex here, if we help the ports around about the UK invest and compete, it's kind of giving the developers no longer excuses there that we can do more capex here because we've got port infrastructure which is ready to go.
Can I just come in there, Alan? I was about to ask you, and I think you just touched on the point, and maybe Richard and Simon, you might would probably have a thought on this as well. That £160 million fund that's been announced by the UK government for UK ports, combined with the Freeport initiative that's going to be coming on stream next year, do you think that will significantly enhance the business case for capex, for capex business wins for UK ports? Do you think that's going to have a significant impact?
It really, and again, I'll give my. I'll let the other gents speak, but for me, it's a little bit more difficult than that, because I think my answer is certain sub-elements it will be difficult for the UK to localise. So things like nacelles, turbine nacelles, traditionally, as the gents talked about, Esberg, these types of mega ports, it's going to take something really, I think to Richard's point, really prescriptive, which is basically you're not getting to unless for things like nacelles, etc. However, things that are like, foundations, for example, that's the UK's big nemesis at the moment. We're seeing a lot of the jackets, etc., flooding over to the Far East. A lot of this oil and gas spare capacity over in the Far East are now churning around jackets, substations, making it very difficult for UK fabricators to compete. So it's not just that build it and it makes it better, but I guess my answer to you would be, unless we've got a place at the races, you've definitely got no chance. So by at least investing in this port facility, it gives us the framework to allow capex to be localised. I'm not going to say it will, but unless we make these investments, unless the Port of Tyne do what they're doing, unless the ABP do what they're doing, we definitely are not going to get capex here.
Richard,
that was the best sitting on the answer fence anyone has ever given, and even talking to the Conservatives.
Richard or Simon, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I'll just say that fund, kind of could be quite contentious, this fund, because we understand that fund is, there's a competition supposedly, but really I think a lot of in the industry know where that's going to get channeled. And so it's not being spread out amongst loads of ports. There's kind of one particular region that's probably going to benefit, potentially has all the kind of the specifications that have been talked through. And I won't say where it is, but it's another East Coast port who haven't really mentioned much today of. But effectively, if they get that, how do other ports feel that government is intervening? So it's a slippery slope here. But equally, if you're that port, of course, you'd probably bite the government's hand off for it. But if there is more generally a kind of funding initiative where government is looking to stimulate investment in various things and also look at the business, pro-business kind of frameworks, planning easements, etc., consenting and all those kind of things, as well as content rules, etc., then possibly yes. But I don't know if Simon's got anything he wants to say. He might think that you've got a chance with it, or you might be quite critical. I'm not sure, Simon.
I think when you see the qualification that was put out on the 1st of December, which basically had the port's name written all over it in terms of in terms of the preconditions that had to apply, it was a little bit unfair. And I think that's subsequently why they put out a further 70 million. But let's be under no bones about it. 160 million plus 70 million is 230. That only built 2/3 of Greenport Hull. Which cost ABP and Siemens, is well publicised and publicly put out in the public domain, 310 million quid. So 230 million only buys you 2/3 of Greenport Hull, or 75% of Greenport Hull. So let's put it this way, it's a start. It might be written for the application process. Yeah, we know it's going to go 35 miles down the road from where we work, but it doesn't mean that there is still not a case for other ports in the UK. Tees is not going to be able to do everything by itself, and one massive grant on the south of the Tees is not going to be able to supply all of the wind farms, Dogger Bank, Seagreen, Inchcape, Berwick, Mar, by itself. When you add in, as Alan said, foundations, turbines, blades, manufacturing, it will probably deliver 25% of that, if you're lucky, by itself. It's not going to be the panacea for everything, Richard.
Simon, I might just jump in. I might just jump in quick with the interests of time as kind of a consideration. I did say that we'd come back to the idea of digitalization to move it on to the topic that you brought up, Simon, in terms of what the Port of Tyne are doing in terms of virtual free ports. I was wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit more about that, and a little bit more about kind of what's involved in a virtual free port for those that wouldn't maybe know what kind of that entails.
Okay. I'll be straight honest. I'm not the best person involved in it at the port. There are other people who are more versed in it than I am. But it's all about obviously using digital technology to virtually connect 4 sites, 2 ports, some manufacturing facilities to enable the free flow of orders, goods, approvals. As I say, I'm not hugely involved in it personally, but it is being developed as we talk. It has been mooted, and I think the detail will come out when we put our application in February next year. But I'm sorry, I'm not the right person to ask that sort of level of detail about it.
Okay.
Just on that topic of digital solutions and digital technology, Richard, you did mention earlier in your presentation when you were talking about Freeports the role of data and automation, the role of that kind of technological solutions will have in the new Freeport environment. Would you be able to just elaborate on that?
I think what Simon's getting at effectively, if we look at the kind of, if go back to my presentation, I did mention that we'd had Freeports in a different form previously, but that was a different era. We didn't have the same technology or the links at the moment. And exactly as Simon says, the opportunity to link up these sites virtually means that you don't necessarily have to have a load of fence panels connecting and protecting all those sites. And you can do things where goods and other things will be moved between them or linked in through sort of virtual tracking systems, inventory systems, all those kind of things that we now probably have. We're in a really good position to use and utilize. And also you'll have the opportunity for port tenants, where some of Simon's tenancy mentions, probably nothing to do with Tyne other than the fact that they lease land from the port and they undertake maritime and cargo activities in the port. But in terms of their ownership and governance and employment rules, all those kind of things, completely separate bodies. But you've now got an opportunity to factor in those entities and the cargo they're handling, the storages facility they're providing, and you can inventory and link it all in, both to the government, but also intrinsically into the cluster. Now there'll be certain things, security and kind of other transparency things that will be a challenge, because some of those want to share things with competitors or outside bodies, etc. Indeed, some of them can't share it. So there's a big role, I think, for technology to play, but it's probably not fully defined yet, and all the systems may exist in, sort of in template format, but haven't been fully designed yet. I think just on automation and others, well, you've got an opportunity to build and invest more with planning easements, with capital allowances for infrastructure investments. So maybe this just shows it's more conducive to getting them in. Now, per se, does that mean that a non-Freeport won't autonomize or do things? Of course not. No, they'll still have the opportunity to do that. And there are certain sectors, I would say, that have been perhaps ahead of the game on certain things. I mean, I've seen some nice automated loading facilities for things like biomass and other heavy bulky cargoes at the Port of Tyne, absolutely. But we've also seen autonomized cranes at container terminals and other things. So I think across the sector, there's lots of opportunities, but not necessarily just because you're a Freeport.
Absolutely, got it.
I might just jump in, or yeah, Tara, you go ahead.
Sorry, Jack. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question just on Freeports, and maybe Richard, you might be the best person to try and answer this. You mentioned earlier that the bidding process is devolved. Obviously, there's quite a lot of ports in the mix for Freeport status. On the island of Ireland, you have Warren Point, Derry, I think, was mentioned. You're looking at Wales, there's Milford Haven or Holyhead. Because it's a devolved process, what's that going to mean in real terms? What kind of implications will that have on the scheme?
I think it's a good point to make, actually, because I think the first point to make is that the English government or the UK government, who are overseeing predominantly the English process, effectively pushing this forward because it's a manifesto commitment, and you'll see the devolved administrations, who will have a slightly different political agenda, are under less pressure time-wise to get things through. And we've had things like regional elections in the UK, which will add things like voter and election purdas in, just to kind of delay the processes even more. Some of the policy matters like trade, customs and tax elements are actually reserved matters for the UK government. Other things like planning, enterprise stimulus, local business rates policy, and one or two of the tax things are devolved matters. So that's why it gets a bit complicated and fiddly, and that's why you effectively need a joined up process. Now, the Scottish government is looking at potentially a slightly different model at the moment. It hasn't decided that it's not going to have Freeports, but it's now looking and consulting very quickly at a sort of enterprise zone plus status, which would be rolled out to all relevant ports, not just a handful. Now, they probably won't achieve as much as a Freeport, but equally they might be a bit more fairer in their blanket distribution across Scotland. So I think in terms of the kind of timescales, that's the big thing. There'll be, I mean, Simon, it's pretty tight timescales for the Port of Tyne to get its bid in by February, when you factor in things like Brexit and getting over pandemics and all those kind of things. So if you imagine, doing the same kind of thing in Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales, I think we're even more tied to timescales. But there could be completely different options in other parts of the UK, though, and you could find that Northern Ireland, I'm not saying this will happen, but there would be a possibility to link up those ports in a bit similar way to the model or suggestion Simon alluded to. You could find that some of those ports in Northern Ireland, Belfast, Warren Point, Larne and Derry, do come together with the airports potentially and look at some kind of corridor approach. And also it's important to factor in those things like deprivation very much. Belfast is a big cluster of economic activity. It's the biggest gateway to Northern Ireland, but it is, and it has seen a lot of investment in recent years, whereas places like Derry haven't necessarily. So, the politics comes into this as well.
Absolutely, and I think unfortunately that's the note that we'll have to end on, because I do see that we're out of time. Thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion, and indeed to everyone who joined us today. But I think a special thanks is in order for our three speakers, Richard, Simon and Alan, for being so generous with their time and for kickstarting a very insightful discussion on the future of UK ports. And thank you as well to Dara and Liam for helping to run these webinars. Before you go, if I could just draw your attention to our upcoming webinar, which is this Friday the 11th. We are hosting a showcase of 5 innovative Irish companies in the ports sector. That's Combilift, Burnluby, Inland and Coastal Marina Systems, William O'Brien, and Netfasa. And as you can see, the registration link is available below. We'll be circulating these slides afterwards, and I believe the registration link is available in the chat. If you have any questions, you can contact myself, Dara, or Liam, but I'm afraid that's all from us. So thank you very much for joining, and we hope to see you at the next Enterprise Ireland webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.